Thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece, Declassified. Episode 3, Dying for Immortality in Homer's Iliad. Rage. Sing, O goddess, of the rage of Peleus' son Achilles and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Greeks, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls of heroes, and left their bodies to the feasting of dogs and birds, as the will of Zeus was done. Thus begins Homer's Iliad, a song about a long-lost world when heroes and demigods once roamed the earth. It's a long, epic story that was told by a bard in a singing, rhythmical voice. In that respect, it's not completely unlike rap music, except hip-hop is a relatively young genre. But imagine if hip-hop continued to exist for 300 more years, and during that time it became more mainstream and prestigious, and every generation of artists memorized the best hits of the previous generation and could incorporate those bits into their own songs. So after 300 years, imagine this becomes an art form enriched with a huge database of songs and stories that every performer has in their head, and they can just spin out lengthy, engaging stories in song by stringing together all these best hits from the past 10 generations. That would be a closer analogy to the kind of artist who put together the Iliad. As the first line of the Iliad, which you just heard, indicates, this is a song about anger. One man's anger, in fact. It starts when Achilles gets really angry, and then a lot of things happen over the course of a few weeks while the Greeks are encamped outside the walls of Troy, and then when Achilles finally ceases to be angry, it ends. And obviously, spoiler alert, the Trojan horse and the sacking of Troy and Achilles getting shot in the heel, none of that happens in the Iliad. The Iliad is a zoomed-in view of just a few weeks in this 10-year war. And it shows what happens during this brief time span when one powerful guy gets really angry, and what has to happen until he stops being angry, and all the consequences of that, and all the people that affects. That's what the story is. Now, that might seem to you to be a random plot choice. Why would anybody care about what happens when one guy gets angry in a semi-fictional war that happened 3,000 years ago and involves gods influencing the course of events just as much as humans? What makes that interesting? Well, the fact is, Homer has remained at the forefront of people's fictional imagination ever since the 8th century BC. From the Romans, who modeled their epics on Homer, to Chaucer and Shakespeare, who both wrote stories about the Trojan War, to movies like O Brother, Where Art Thou, and more obviously, Troy, Homer has been influencing our fictional universe for millennia. So what's the deal with Homer? Why does this first poem that ever appears in European literature, why has it been so influential and enduring? That, unfortunately, we can't answer in just one episode, and we'll have more episodes on Homer later. I mean, you could do a whole podcast on Homer. But what we can try to do today is to dive into the story and to try to get a sense of what Homer is giving us with this epic. What kind of vision of the world does this epic entail, and why does he zoom in to this short period of days out of a 10-year-long struggle? We'll start by looking at how the story begins, and then we're going to jump to the finale, to the scene that puts an end to Achilles' anger and to the story. A scene some have claimed is the most moving in all of Western literature. Once again, there will be spoilers. Everyone in antiquity that went to hear the story already knew what was going to happen, and they went anyway. This is hardly a spoilable story, but you're forewarned anyway. Here with us today, to help us see the world through Homer's eyes, is a preeminent Homeric scholar. Andrew Ford, professor of classics at Princeton University, has written on not just Homer, but also tragedy and philosophy, and even the poetry of Aristotle. And yes, there is such a thing. So he has a broad perspective to share with us. Andrew Ford, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
How many times would you say you've read through the entire Iliad?
Oh, countless times. even to read a part of it is to have the whole thing come into view.
Do you find something new each time you read it?
Absolutely. The more you slow down and look at detail, the more impressed you are that this is a work of incredible depth.
Now, there's a question I've got to ask you because a lot of listeners will be wondering what your take is. And this is a very loaded and complex question, but do you think there was one person called Homer that stitched this whole thing together?
Yes, I'm more and more impressed as I read the Iliad with the overall design. There was a time when I was young and fiery that I was overwhelmed by the little contradictions and details that don't work, that are undoubtedly there, but more and more now I see it as as you say, something that it was stitched together, but very well put together.
How likely is it that this is the same author that stitched together the Odyssey?
Pretty unlikely in my view. The Odyssey just opens its eyes on a different world, and its language is somewhat different from the Iliad's.
So if Homer is the author of one of these poems, do we know anything about him as a person?
We know what the Greeks 400 or 300 years later said about him. They had stories, for example, that he was blind, but that seems to go back to the picture of a blind singer that he depicts in the Odyssey. So there's so little known that nothing prevents certain scholars from saying that no Homer ever existed, and it all just came together by itself.
Do you think that the compiler of the Iliad in the form that we have it now wrote it down, or was there an oral period of preservation until it was finally written down?
I think both. It's certainly, let's say, around 700 BC, give or take 50 years. About that time, the oral traditions about the Trojan War yielded this version of this episode. And at that point, it probably was written down in some form, although these singers were capable of great feats of memorization.
If you could be sent back in time and reincarnated or pre-incarnated as any character in the epic, who would it be?
As a character in the epic? Well, I don't think I'm courageous enough to want to be either Achilles or Hector. I'd like to be somebody who watches things from the side. So maybe Nestor.
Interesting. We'll meet Nestor in a bit, but
You've spent years studying these epics, and unlike most of us, when you read them, you can actually hear in your head how it sounds in the original language. So would you mind reciting the first few lines of the poem to give us a taste of how it might have sounded back then?
Oh, menena edethea, peleia jo Achilleus, ulo menen hemuriakaios alge etheken. Polas diptimus psychas aidi proiapsen, heroon autuste, heloria toke knesen, oio noisite passi, dios deteleto bule.
Beautiful, and just to remind us what the English is?
Wrath, sing goddess of the ruinous wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, that inflicted woes without number upon the Achaeans, hurled forth to Hades many strong souls of warriors, and rendered their bodies prey for the dogs and all the birds. And the will of Zeus was accomplished.
So in the first line, he calls on a goddess to sing. Who is this goddess?
This is the Muse, the child of memory, as we hear in Hesiod, mnemosyne, and it points back to the oral traditions from which the poets first derived. These songs were delivered orally. They were not read by anybody. Even if texts were circulating in the society, they were a performative genre, much like hip-hop, as you say.
You wrote a book called Homer, Poetry of the Past. And to clarify for our listeners, this is not poetry of the past in the sense that it's really old poetry from the distant past. The idea is that with respect to Homer's own time, he's telling his audiences about the far distant past from their standpoint.
Absolutely. Yes. You have to bear in mind that, let's say Homer is singing in 700 BC. The Greeks themselves thought that the Trojan War fell around, let's say, 1184 BC, but centuries earlier. So when they went in to hear these tales, it was something like an English person hearing tales of King Arthur's court, or indeed maybe Americans hearing tales of the Wild West, or maybe the Founding Fathers, some period in the distant past where the national character is thought to still have its essential values, but to be a somewhat ruder, cruder, and more powerful.
Now, in your book, you mention an older Homeric scholar of a previous generation, Albert Lord, who studied not just Homer, but also other epic traditions, some of which are still alive today. And he said, which you quote, "The traditional oral epic singer is not an artist, he is a seer. The patterns of thought that he has inherited come into being to serve not art, but religion in its most basic sense." So when the bard performs for listeners at this time period and he calls on the muse, is he like a shaman who's channeling divine power, or is he an entertainer who's using a literary device to give an introduction?
That's an excellent question. Remember Byron introducing Don Juan as "Hail, Muse," etc., and then going on with the poem. Where are we on that spectrum between magical, archaic belief and sophisticated literary reference? I think we're rather closer toward the magical social side, simply because, as I say again, this was not a novel. This was not something to be read privately. It was a communal experience to be performed before a group. And so as soon as you hit that sing muse, everybody knows that they're going to be transported out of the music hall they may be, the tavern where they may be listening, the palace where they may be listening to the singer, and to go back in their imaginations to a world that was inaccessible, because it wasn't one with written records, except through the medium of the bard's song.
One of people's least favorite scenes in the Iliad is the catalog of ships, where Homer just spends, I don't know how many pages, just listing all the different leaders and all the number of ships they took to Troy. It's kind of hard to get through, but he starts by making a claim about knowledge and, I guess, access to history. So is he claiming in any way to be a historian?
He's claiming to preserve memories of the past, and indeed he does. If you compare the geography implied in that catalog, and I agree with you that it's not something that the beginning reader need feel ashamed about if he or she passes over it quickly, but the material really is archaic. It is not, once again, the world of 700 BC in the Aegean. It is end of the Bronze Age. So he does have material, he does have lore, he does have language that we can tell is 1,000 years old in some cases. And so he is bringing us stuff from the past, but he doesn't have the attitude of critical inquiry that a Thucydides or even a Herodotus would take toward this material.
The very first word of the epic is rage. And Greek grammar is flexible in that you can start a sentence with pretty much any word in that sentence, which you can't really do in English. So Homer could have begun the story with any other word in that first sentence, but he chose rage. How important is the bard's choice of this first word?
I think it's crucial. Again, in an oral medium, the first word or two of a poem was typically the title of the poem. The Iliad is not the name of the poem. That's a later name put on, the song about Ilion or Troy. It's what Homer would have presented to people was the wrath of Achilles. So it's partly just a matter of convenience, but partly, too, it does epitomize the theme of the poem very well. The song is, as you say, not really about the whole Trojan War story. It begins when the moment when Achilles gets mad, and it ends when he finally seems to let go of that anger.
At the end of the passage that you read for us, we get this incredible line. After all this suffering is happening, and then he says, "And the will of Zeus was accomplished." And within the next few pages, we hear that the plague that is devastating the army is caused by Apollo, who's angry, and he's shooting his shafts of disease among them. So in this world, how much do the gods direct human affairs, and is there any room left for free will?
I think that's a question that modern readers are very often bound to ask themselves. And the short answer is that it's really no different from you and I today. It's just that we live in a world where there are clearly larger forces around us, forces that can destroy us and forces that can actually give us great benefits. We do the best to make sure that those forces are favorable to us, the best that our technology and that our good luck charms can do for us. But in the end, we recognize that they have a purpose, as it were, of its own. So the short answer is, when Athena, for example, grabs Achilles by the hair and says, "Don't stab your commander-in-chief," in Book 1, you can say that, oh, Achilles has no freedom. Or you can say that Achilles was about to stab his leader and said, "Wait, I can't do this. This is really beyond the pale." And so that the heroic action and the divine intervention really coalesce into a rich, they call it an overdetermined action that makes sense on all levels. The participation of the gods in heroic action magnifies the heroic choices. It does not diminish them. It makes them greater, because these are men that struggled with and beside the gods.
So when Odysseus, say, throws a javelin and Athena gives him a boost of strength to throw it even further than normal, that's like a kind of a compliment that actually shows that Odysseus is even greater than...
Yeah.
It doesn't diminish from his
Homer would have said that with 3 seconds left on the clock, Michael Jordan pumped a 3-shotter and Hera came down and guided the ball cleanly through the nets.
Wonderful. Did Homer's audiences, though, believe that there were gods as described who behaved as described?
I think they more or less thought that the gods had the morality that they have in Homer, which we could talk about in a second. They're not the Judeo-Christian God that rewards good and punishes evil. But the key thing about the whole story, and this actually goes through the Odyssey, is the whole cycle of what we call the heroic age. That's the best word for this distant kind of King Arthur realm that I'm talking about. The whole cycle explains, among other things, why the gods no longer come down and visit us. You can see traces in the Odyssey where Odysseus comes to town. People say, "Boy, he looks like a god," and this happens in Iliad too. Could be a god, I don't know. But these days, we don't see the gods much anymore. So I think they could live quite comfortably, thinking in the old days, the gods used to come down to earth. And after the end of the Trojan War, the two realms separated and did their business with greater distance between them.
So in this worldview, the world of humans is in this kind of perpetual state of decline from prior greatness.
Absolutely, yes. There was a golden age before, and you hear the Iliad poet a number of times saying that Hector or someone picked up a stone such as it would take 10 men today to lift up. So yes, they had the belief that we live in an iron age, and there was once an age of gold.
Let me rephrase my question, though, on religion. So as far back as we can go in the historical period,
we find people enjoying the Iliad and Odyssey while at the same time being critical of how the gods are portrayed as all too human. Already in the 6th century BC, Xenophanes makes fun of Homer's gods and says, yeah, well, if the cows had gods, they would look like cows.
Right.
So as far back as we can go historically, we seem to see a skepticism, at least among the writers that have survived. So can we go far back enough where people actually believed what Homer says, that's what the gods were doing?
I see. That's a nice attitude. In other words, that the gods in Homer are kind of a almost Baroque fantasy of what it might be like in heaven. I think there is a good element of that. There is a certain stylization to their behavior.
Edith Hamilton, a classicist from 100 years ago or so, wrote that we should not confuse religion and mythology with the Greeks. So is that a helpful rule of thumb, that this is kind of mythology but not necessarily religion?
I think that's a good separation to make in this case. These are the same deities that were worshipped in temples and in cult sites under these same names, but they are decidedly a fictional representation of the deities in which the poet enjoys himself and will indulge in some scenes, such as the Feast of the Gods at the end of Book 1, where everybody makes fun of the lame god Hephaestus because he's hobbling around serving the drinks, and they seem rather mean and ignoble. And yet that same book closes with a kind of magisterial tone as Zeus and Hera go to bed, and their concord up in Olympus contrasts sharply with the chaos prevailing on earth.
I'd like to read to you a passage from Longinus. So Longinus is a Greek of the Roman period writing about literature, what, like 700 years after Homer?
Yep.
Okay. So he says, "Terrible as these passages are about the gods, they are utterly irreligious or sacrilegious and breach the canons of propriety unless one takes them allegorically. I feel indeed that in recording as Homer does the wounding of the gods, their quarrels, vengeance, tears, imprisonment, and all their manifold passions, Homer has done his best to make the men in the Iliad gods and the gods men."
That's a wonderful passage in Longinus, one of many. It is true that Homer's representation of the gods drew objections from many Greeks in later times. Plato is the most famous one. In the Republic, he was, or affected to be, scandalized by how bad those gods behaved. I think the key thing standing in the way of thinking about Homeric gods is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we expect the gods to be good. And the Greek gods are bent on, as Longinus says, they are just exalted, noble men and women. They are human beings with all the appetites and feelings of human beings magnified. And so they are jealous of their honor, they are proud, they are vengeful, they get angry. Gods in the Iliad do not punish sin. What they do is they avenge themselves on mortals who disrespect them. I tell my students sometimes to think of Zeus more like the godfather than like the father with the white fluffy beard.
Let's get into what causes the quarrel to break out between Agamemnon and Achilles. So this is already the 10th year of the war. The Greeks have been sacking different cities around the area to maintain the army, and also because they're just sackers of cities. And at this point, all the chiefs have their own prize girl that they've stolen from these various cities. So what's the source then of the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon?
Yes, it is a kind of like a game of musical chairs, isn't it? As you say, the prizes after each victory, as they sack the cities nearby, the prizes are distributed. And here it's very important to realize that the prizes are distributed according to one's status and dignity in the army. These are people who need material validation of their worth in society. And so what happens, and this has been going on successfully for 10 years, Agamemnon as the leader has been getting the most prizes. Achilles as the best fighter has been getting a lot of good prizes. But in this economy, and we might note in passing at least that it's really a matter of exchanging women to show the value of men. In this economy, suddenly one token is pulled out by Apollo. That's why, that's where the poem starts. And so when this priest, who happens to have Apollo's ear, this priest Chryses, complains to Apollo that the Greeks will not give him back his girl, ransom her back, then the trouble starts.
Agamemnon's prize is the daughter of this priest, right?
Yes, indeed.
And he asks Agamemnon to give her back, and he offers tons of treasure.
And Agamemnon says basically, get out of here or else. And so the priest goes away and he prays to Apollo and says, "O Apollo, if I've ever pleased you with my sacrifices, make the Greeks pay for my tears with your arrows."
Right, exactly. So notice that, again, it's an act of ransom. Agamemnon would give up the girl, but he would get material signs to reconfirm his status. They have been ransoming people, too, for a decade. They've had this whole civilized way of conducting war for these 10 years. They are very much interested in presenting themselves not as pirates and freebooters, but as an army with standards and with ways of behaving. So Agamemnon, it seems that he miscalculates here. He cannot bear to have his honor visibly diminished in front of his army. For some reason, he will not say, okay, I'll take the money and you have the girl back. He refuses, and then Apollo takes action, and he sends a plague to the Greeks. And then things get bad enough that the Greeks are forced to consult the priest, and the priest says, Agamemnon, you've got to give back this priest's daughter, because that's why we're suffering.
So suddenly the leader of the kings, the king of kings, is without a visible prize. So is this a public relations crisis?
It's a public relations crisis and more. It's an institutional crisis. The way to be a big man is to have a lot of goods, to have a lot of clients, to bestow from your vast hoard of wealth gifts on others and to receive gifts in return. So Agamemnon is losing more than just face. His leadership is imperiled.
As Achilles points out in their discussion about how to stop the plague, Agamemnon doesn't really do much fighting, right? He commands armies, but he's not in the front lines the way Achilles is.
Well, he's not an insignificant fighter indeed, but he is the leader of the expedition. He brings the most ships, he brings the most money, and most importantly of all, he is acting in behalf of his brother, Menelaus. And Menelaus is the wounded party. Menelaus has suffered a loss of face because back in Greece long ago, well, 10 years ago, Menelaus was married to Helen, the most beautiful woman in Greece. And Paris of Troy in those days came and visited her and spirited her away to Troy. The story behind that is another one, but we won't go into it. All the stories in Homer have these lovely background stories. So Menelaus has a legitimate grievance against Trojan. Once again, this expedition against Troy is not a booty raid. It's not plunder that they're after. It's to revenge their sense of honor. And Agamemnon, as his brother, symbolizes the civilized and institutionally valid basis of the attack.
Now, as this quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon breaks out over their prizes, and Achilles is about to draw his sword, but Athena appears and says, hold on, then Nestor jumps in, right? So who is Nestor and what does he try to do here?
Nestor stands for the voice of experience. He's old. He's fought in earlier wars. He tells these kids if he were young like he was in the old days, he'd show them what a warrior should be. But he also acts as a bearer of sage counsel and tradition. He tries to pour oil on these troubled waters.
And he tells Agamemnon to refrain from taking Achilles' prize.
Yes, he tries to counsel long-term thinking, but these warriors, jealous of their honor, seem neither one able to calculate in those terms.
I mean, we should keep in mind that this is already the 10th year, right? They're probably really tired, really exhausted. They didn't plan on being here this long.
They're practically ready to bolt and leave home in the next book.
And Nestor is so old that he's actually known some of the more famous heroes. So from what Nestor says here, it seems that from the perspective of Homer's audience, the Trojan War is a golden age of heroism that is gone. But within the story, that is already a decline from an earlier, even grander era.
That's true. And Nestor himself thinks that the fighters of his day are not such as the ones that he knew when he was a boy. And indeed, legend had it that Troy had been earlier sacked by Heracles or Hercules. And Hercules is a kind of a monstrously strong and successful hero in comparison with which these more humanized figures don't look quite as magnificent.
So in this meeting between the Greeks where Achilles and Agamemnon fight and then Nestor butts in and says, when I was your age, that whole thing, there is already at this point 5 or 6 characters that have spoken. So would the poet be impersonating these different voices and bringing them to life in different ways?
We have every reason to think so. If you just look at the pages, about half of it is dramatic dialogue. And this is for good reason, then, that Plato said that Homer is the father of tragedy, the father of drama. And Plato's classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, has some interesting evidence for how that was performed. The professional performers would be called rhapsodes. They'd wear very attention-getting robes, and they'd have crowns on their head. They'd carry a scepter-like stick saying, "Listen to me." And what is very clear is that when a character started to speak, the rhapsode would get into it and would wail if this character was sad. And so in this way, and it touches on what I was mentioning about the more magical aspect of the transportation to the heroic world, in this way the audience is not hearing a story about the past, but they're almost watching Achilles yell at Agamemnon. Then a minute later, they'll be watching Nestor trying to rise when his old voice calmed things down. It was a very dramatic affair, and we know was tremendously emotionally powerful on its audience.
So when Agamemnon has to give up his musical chair, he takes Achilles' war prize girl, and Achilles is especially angry because, unlike the other Greek leaders, he has no obligation to Agamemnon. Most of the other Greek kings had competed with each other to marry Helen, and they all swore that they would protect whoever she picks for a husband, which ends up being Menelaus. But Achilles wasn't part of that competition, so he's not under any such obligation. So what's in it for him? Why is he even here?
Well, you may well ask, and Achilles asks that question very powerfully in the 9th book. This was a way for a young man to go join a major expedition fighting for the honor of Greece. This was a way for a young man to get wealth, increase his status, and indeed to make connections with other nobles throughout Greece, and so he'd have the choice of rich families to marry into, etc. So it made sense for Achilles to join this expedition, provided they played fair with him, that his best fighting was given the best prize.
But doesn't he also have a sense that he will die in the war?
There is that tremendous self-consciousness that Achilles uniquely has because his mother, of course, is the goddess Thetis. And it has been prophesied that if he stays there in Troy fighting, he will die. If he goes home, he will live a long but a relatively obscure old age.
But if he dies, he will get what?
He will get eternal glory. And that's what the poem is giving him. Here again, I would add, though, that if you think about it, although Achilles has this kind of supernatural knowledge that makes him seem more aware than we are, the choice that he faces is really the same choice for every warrior. Do you go to battle, expose yourself to danger, the possibility of risk, or do you hang back home and play it safe? There's a beautiful speech on this in the 12th book between Sarpedon and Glaucus, two Trojan fighters on the Trojan side. And Sarpedon says, you know, if we didn't die, I wouldn't fight like this. But I fight like this because we die, and so that while we live, by fighting, we will get the choicest wines, we will get the precedence in the assemblies, we will be treated almost like gods. That's the way to make life sweet.
So as you mentioned, Athena appears to Achilles. He's so angry at Agamemnon in the meeting that he is about to draw his sword and just kill him right there. But Athena appears to him and just to him and says, hold on, don't do this now. You will be rewarded thrice in the future if you restrain yourself, right? So then Achilles withdraws from the battle, and for the next 10, 15 books, the Greeks are just massacred left and right by the Trojans, right? I mean, of course, you have occasional moments of glory for the Greeks, but overall, they're losing very badly.
That's a downward trend. A few people step up, but yes, Homer shows us that these are the 10,000 woes that Achilles inflicted upon the Achaeans when he stood by and watched as the Trojans became ever more successful, almost at some point setting their Greek camp on fire.
And as you hinted at with the story of Glaucus and Sarpedon, we get glimpses into the Trojan side as well, and they're very well portrayed. They're portrayed as nobly, or even sometimes more nobly, than the Greeks. In fact, Hector, some people say, is the protagonist of the whole story. So isn't this quite remarkable that the antagonists, the opposing side, is portrayed so favorably?
Yes, it's a wonderful choice. The poem would have certainly been far less dramatic if Homer had painted the Trojans the way the Greeks sometimes condescended to the Eastern civilizations as barbarians and slavish in their demeanor. But it's also the case that to ennoble the enemy is to increase the status of the victory. And so for the Greeks to be fighting 10 years against an enemy must mean dramatically that this enemy is a considerable foe. And therefore, there's also a ideological reason for Homer to make the Trojans more than contemptible foreigners. Still, that being said, he goes much further, and we have the most tender scenes between Hector and Andromache and Priam and his wife, which one can only say evinces an astonishing well of human sympathy.
The German philosopher Nietzsche argued that the world of Homer represents a different kind of moral system than the one we have. We live in a world of good versus evil. And many modern readers, when they read the Iliad, they're always waiting for the bad guy to show up, and they don't get the bad guy. So for Nietzsche, this is a world where instead of good versus evil, you have just good and not good, and there is no pure evil. I mean, can you think of a single character in either the Iliad or the Odyssey who's just evil in the sense of just cruel for no other reason than they're just bad to the bone?
Well, there are minor characters. Some of the suitors are pretty bad, and Thersites is at least contemptible. But you're quite right that the morality of the Iliad is not good against evil. It's the heroic impulse versus the limits of human mortality.
If Nietzsche is right that this concept of evil is not used to explain all these terrible things that happen, like killing and suffering and sacking of cities, if evil is not the explanation for why that happens, what is the explanation?
Well, here we...
The wrath?
The wrath, but the wrath is occasioned by a very trivial thing when we come back to the musical chairs analogy. And you could say that Homer is almost demonstrating how great disastrous consequences can rise from the smallest little things. And indeed, if you step back and think of the opening scene we've been discussing, it plays almost as an echo of the entire Trojan War itself, which after all, once again, was about a Greek chieftain being deprived of a woman and determined at great price to get that prize back, to avenge his honor, to save his face. And so Homer is almost telling us, I know it comes from small things. The wrath is powerful, but there it is.
Let's skip ahead really far. The Greeks are losing terribly because Achilles has withdrawn from the fight. Everybody's begging him to come back, but Achilles refuses. And then Patroclus, Achilles' friend, says, "Come on, Achilles, you can stay here, but at least let me lead our troops to save the Greeks," which Achilles allows. But then Hector kills Patroclus, and then Achilles, with a desire for revenge, enters the battle finally and kills Hector. And so the grand finale is the scene where Priam, the father of Hector, the old king of Troy, he sneaks into the Greek camp, guided by the god Hermes, and he comes into the tent of the man who has slain his son and defiled the body of his son. It's an extraordinary moment where the man he probably hates more than anybody else in the world, he enters his tent and grabs his knees and begs for the body of his son.
He says, "Pity me, I have suffered what no man has suffered. I have put my lips to the hand of the man who slaughtered my son." And what is Priam there for? He's there to have a ransom. He's there to buy back the body of his son so that he can give it a decent burial. So it's a beautiful resolution, in a way, of the tearing of the social fabric in Book 1, when Agamemnon refused to ransom his war prize Chryseis to her father, the priest. And that led to incredible breakdown in the military order. And it's interesting to watch when Achilles does come back fighting to kill Hector, when he does accept the choice that he knows, if I do this, I'm going to die, but I'm going back to the war. He captures some people and they say, "Achilles, ransom me back to my parents. They're loaded." Achilles says, "In the old days I would have, but now all that has lost meaning for me." And he kills them and throws them in the river.
He's on a rampage.
He's berserking. And here, I think, for the second half of the poem, what's really illuminated this for me is a book called Achilles in Vietnam by a psychotherapist called Jonathan Shea, treating Vietnam and other veterans who have had difficulties coping with their war experience back. And the great thing he makes you realize is that real soldiers in war, they don't fight for a country, an ideal, a slogan, a party. They're fighting for their brothers in arms. And so what really happens to Achilles, there is the whole issue of honor and saving face and booty, but it's when he loses Patroclus, his kind of second, his lieutenant, his closest, when he loses him, that's what he's fighting for. And that's indeed what a lot of soldiers suffer. So this helps us focus our question of what's going on in Achilles in the end. And there are several approaches. Some people want to say that Achilles learns or grows, but I think this is to take a novelistic approach to the poem, as if it were a novel and the character is supposed to develop and comes to some kind of realization. I agree with those who say he doesn't learn much except he learns to accept his fate and to go on. So in Book 9, Achilles says, what am I doing here? Why am I fighting these Trojans? I'm not got any problem with them. They didn't take my wife. To paraphrase a modern Achilles, I got nothing against those Viet Cong. And he really questions the whole war. And then he comes back into the war, but not because he believes anymore in the system, but because of his buddy.
When Priam enters the tent of Achilles, which his wife Hecuba warns him not to do, says, are you crazy? You're going into the enemy camp? But he goes anyway, and what does he say to Achilles to get sympathy? I think he brings up Achilles' father.
Yes. Fathers and son is a major theme of the poem. And he says, look at me, I have lost my son. I have no one to protect me. And Achilles realizes that his choice to avenge Patroclus means that he will no longer be able to go back home to his father, who is aged but still alive, and stand up for him as he goes on into his old age without defense.
And Priam says, think of your father, who right now may be
beset by enemies,
yeah. And you're not there to help him. Right?
Absolutely.
So there's a moment of reconciliation between mortal enemies. And Homer says that Achilles looked at Priam and marveled at his noble stature.
Mm-hmm. That's a very powerful moment. Achilles, at this point, is all consideration. When he tells his attendants to get Hector's body ready, he tells him, do it outside. I don't want his father to see the brutalized corpse and get his father all upset. And when Priam expresses a desire to get done with the business and get home, Achilles insists that they eat, that they break bread together. And to do so, he tells him a Greek myth. He gives a story about Niobe and that she ate, even though she lost 6 sons and 6 daughters. It's part of that awareness that Homer seems to have, that tale-telling. One of its functions can be to bring a shattered consciousness somehow back into order. Achilles and Priam, they're able to establish some kind of companionship in their sorrows, but the war will go on, and Achilles knows he will die.
So Achilles asks, how many days do you need to give Hector a proper burial? And Priam says 11 days. So Achilles says, okay, I'll make sure the Greeks don't fight you during that time, and then we'll resume being enemies, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So as you pointed out, we have the beginning of the epic with a failed ransom attempt, and now the end of the epic with a successful ransom attempt. And we have the beginning of the wrath, the first word is wrath, and now we have the end of the anger. So is this a structurally unified work? And I ask because one of the foremost Homeric scholars of the past century, the late Martin West, suggested decades ago that maybe Homer didn't finish the epic, that he should have gone on until the death of Achilles, and that would be an even grander, more dramatic ending. So do you buy that?
Well, in fact, we do have a manuscript or two in which the last line of the Iliad, as we have it, is followed by another line suggesting, well, then the Amazons came in and the whole battle with the Amazons started, another legendary episode in Greek mythology. That, in a nutshell, to me, is the art of the Iliad. And like you suggested, when I first read the Iliad, I said, wow, there's no Trojan horse here. I didn't quite appreciate what the author was trying to do, that in that short compass, he had got everything he needed to get in.
So in those manuscripts, which end with, and then the Amazons came, presumably that would allow the bard, if the audiences wanted to hear more, to segue into the next episode. But if, as Martin West suggested, there was a version of the Iliad that continued all the way to the death of Achilles, Once Hector's dead, this balance that we talked about, where the strength of your adversary reflects on your strength, once Hector is out of the picture, the Trojans have no chance. It's only a matter of time. I mean, the Greeks might need a ruse to get inside the walls, but there's really no challenge, no equal in strength to the Greek warriors. So doesn't that fundamentally change the story?
That's why you cue the Amazons. We need somebody, they're coming in to help the Trojans. In theory, the saga continues to the Odyssey and how Odysseus made his way home after the Trojan War. So the poet does have to make a choice of where to begin and where to end, and he really is very powerful in both. The beginning is quick, and it goes right to the point of conflict, and the end is a rather breathtaking diminuendo. It closes on a funeral of this noble Hector, no less, as you say, and the laments are given by his closest female kin, by his mother, by his wife, and Helen of Troy herself, who is Hector's sister-in-law, after all. And I've often played with the idea that the poem is coming to an end as these women sing or tell to us how much it cost to be a soldier. What is the loss to the community for the hero slain in war? And so, in a sense, I tend to regard those laments as sort of the seeds from which later people would tell their heroic stories, would tell the stories of the deaths of heroes, and that Homer might be putting the origin of the great Greek epics, the great Greek male sagas, he might be putting their ultimate source in the mourning voices of the women who are left behind when all the heroes are slain.
Wonderful. So for any of our listeners who would like now to revisit the Iliad or maybe read it for the first time, what are your favorite translations to recommend?
Well, everybody who knows the Greek loves Richmond Lattimore because it's the most faithful, and it reflects a little bit of the often austere, noble dignity of the text. I'd open a page or two and see if you like to read that and can imagine reading 100 pages of it. If you want something that's more flowing and closer to modern idiom, I think Robert Fagel's is as good as anyone, or Robert Fitzgerald, which has the extra benefit of having an introduction written by none other than Andrew Ford, which I think is very rich. And those three probably are the most popular. There's a new one that's getting a good deal of attention by Caroline Alexander, which looks very good and may well be quite to one's taste as well. But I urge everybody, open it and read a few pages and see if this fits. Above all, let it flow. This is a long entertainment.
Andrew Ford, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
As always, you listeners out there are invited to share your thoughts, comments, questions at greasepodcast.com/3. That's number 3 for this 3rd episode. Or even at facebook.com/greasepodcast. Click the like button while you're there. Also, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Grease Podcast to stay up to date on upcoming episodes and other news. And if you want to support us, please rate and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. We'd really appreciate that. In addition to the translations just recommended for the Iliad, there is another way that you can enjoy this epic story. The Trojan War podcast, which tells the whole story of the Trojan War, including all the backstories alluded to today, as well as the aftermath of the Iliad. Jeff Wright, who does the podcast, is a professional storyteller. So you won't be getting Homer's version, but in a way, you'll be getting a Homeric experience because you'll be hearing someone perform the story for you. So check that out and then come back here for our next episode where we're going to move away from these long epic songs to shorter songs about love. At the risk of sounding like Kanye West, I'm going to let you go now, but next time we're going to meet one of the greatest songwriters of all time, Sappho. Thanks for listening to Ancient Greece, Declassified.
Can you still sing Orpheus? Then sing something that's going to last. 1,000 years slips by so fast, goes off into a dusty myth with you.